April 15th, 1945. Dresden, Germany. The air was thick with the scent of wet ash and desperation as Private First Class Thomas Mitchell of the 1st Marine Division trudged through the remnants of what had once been a thriving city centre. Rain fell in a gentle, steady rhythm, turning the ground beneath his boots into a grey slurry of mud and pulverized concrete. The young Marine believed this would be just another routine patrol through conquered territory, another forgettable day in the grinding aftermath of conflict. He could not have imagined how a simple act of kindness would connect him to one of the most extraordinary stories of the European campaign. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how a chance encounter between enemies would reveal the profound truth that humanity's capacity for compassion can transcend the artificial boundaries of nationality, revealing connections that would forever alter the course of two lives and expose a network of resistance that had remained hidden throughout the most devastating conflict in modern history. Thomas Mitchell had been in Europe for 178 days. Originally from Portland, Maine, the 22-year-old had landed with the Marines at Normandy and fought his way across France and into Germany. Before the conflict, Thomas had been studying engineering at Boston College, a promising student whose professors saw great potential in his methodical mind and steady hands. Now those hands gripped his M1 Garand rifle as he navigated the destruction of Dresden, a city that had endured one of the most controversial bombing campaigns of the conflict. "Keep your eyes open," Lieutenant Jackson called from the front of the patrol. "Intelligence says there might still be pockets of resistance in this sector." Sergeant Paul Donovan, a barrel-chested veteran from Chicago who had fought in North Africa before being transferred to the European theater, snorted in disbelief. "Resistance? Look around you, these people can barely stand, let alone fight." He was not wrong. The civilians they encountered appeared as ghosts, hollow-eyed, gaunt, and moving with the slow, uncertain gait of the truly malnourished. American intelligence estimated that the average German civilian in Dresden was subsisting on fewer than 800 calories per day, less than half the recommended intake for an adult. The production capacity of Germany had been systematically dismantled by Allied bombing. Before the conflict, Germany had produced approximately 400,000 tons of meat annually. By early 1945, that number had plummeted to less than 90,000 tons. Bread production had fallen by 60%, and the dairy industry had all but collapsed, with milk availability for civilians reduced to less than 1/8 of pre-conflict levels. "They made their choice when they supported their regime," Lieutenant Jackson replied, but there was little conviction in his voice. The human suffering on display had a way of eroding even the most hardened resolve. Thomas Mitchell had joined the patrol with an extra pack. The shipment of K rations had arrived that morning, and he had volunteered to distribute them to his unit. His pack contained 9 boxes of the field rations, each one a small cardboard package containing canned meat, biscuits, sugar packets, instant coffee, and the most coveted item, chocolate bars. Originally designed to provide approximately 3,000 calories per day, these rations represented unimaginable wealth to the starving civilians of Dresden. The patrol turned down a narrow street lined with partially collapsed buildings. Most had been elegant 4-story structures before the bombing, homes to the upper middle class of Dresden, a city once known as the Florence of the Elbe for its Baroque and Rococo architecture. Now they were little more than jagged walls and exposed rooms, the private spaces of their former occupants, laid bare to the elements in a grotesque violation of domesticity. It was then that Thomas saw her. Standing in the shadow of a crumbling doorway was a woman who appeared to be in her early 30s, though hardship had a way of accelerating age. Her clothes, once fine, were now threadbare and patched in multiple places. Despite her obvious deprivation, there was something in her bearing that spoke of dignity, maintained against impossible odds. Her posture remained straight, her gaze direct, and her blonde hair, though dull from malnutrition, was neatly combed and pinned. What struck Thomas most, however, were her eyes. Blue and clear, they held none of the defeated vacancy he had come to expect from the civilians they encountered. Instead, they burned with an intensity that caught him off guard, not hatred or fear, but a fierce determination to endure. As the patrol passed, the woman stepped back further into the shadows, It was a small, instinctive movement, but it triggered something in Thomas. Without fully considering his actions, he broke formation and approached the doorway. "Mitchell, what are you doing?" Sergeant Donovan called. "Just a second, Sarge," Thomas replied, already unshouldering his pack. Lieutenant Jackson turned, his expression a mix of irritation and resignation. "Make it quick. We need to complete this patrol before 1800 hours. Thomas nodded and turned his attention to the woman, who regarded him with wary surprise. He opened his pack and pulled out one of the K-ration boxes. "Here," he said, extending it toward her. When she made no move to take it, he added, "Food for you." The woman's eyes flickered to the box, then back to Thomas's face, as if searching for some trick or trap. "Bitte," Thomas said, exhausting his limited German vocabulary in an attempt to bridge the gap between them. "Please." For a moment he thought she would refuse. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached out and accepted the box, her fingers, thin but remarkably elegant, briefly touching his. "Danke," she said, her voice low and cultured, even in that single word. Thomas hesitated, feeling as though there was more to say, but lacking the language to express it. Finally, he simply nodded and rejoined his patrol, aware of the curious glances from his fellow Marines. "Making friends with the locals, Mitchell?" Private James Cooper asked with a smirk. Thomas shrugged. "Just seems like the right thing to do." "Save your charity for people who did not support the enemy," Lieutenant Jackson said, though there was little heat in the reprimand. "We will be back in this sector tomorrow. I want to check those buildings on the eastern perimeter." As the patrol continued, Thomas found his thoughts returning to the woman in the doorway. There had been something in her eyes, a recognition, perhaps, or an understanding, that had made the encounter feel significant in ways he could not articulate. Helene Weber, for that was indeed the name of the woman who had accepted Thomas Mitchell's ration, waited until the patrol had disappeared around the corner before retreating into the building. Once an elegant townhouse belonging to a prominent Dresden family, it now served as a refuge for a small group of survivors. The main structure had miraculously remained standing, while buildings on either side had been reduced to rubble. Helene moved carefully through the darkened interior, navigating fallen beams and shattered furniture, until she reached a door that appeared to lead to a closet. Sliding it aside revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. She made her way down the steps with practiced ease, eventually emerging into a cellar that had been converted into a makeshift living space. 3 people looked up at her entrance, an elderly man with a scholar's wire-rimmed glasses and trembling hands, a dark-haired woman in her 40s who sat near a small, carefully shielded lamp, and a teenage boy whose thin face carried the shadow of what would one day be a strong jawline. All bore the hallmarks of prolonged hunger, but like Helene, they carried themselves with quiet dignity. "Any news?" the elderly man asked, his voice carrying the refined accents of academia. Helene held up the K-ration box. "An unexpected gift from an American Marine." The older woman's eyebrows rose. "He simply gave it to you, without asking for anything in return?" "Yes, Margaret," Helene replied, carefully opening the box and surveying its contents. He seemed different from the others. "Different how?" the teenage boy asked, his eyes fixed on the food Helene was removing from the box. Helene considered this for a moment. "He looked at me as a person, not as an enemy or a victim. There was recognition." Professor Friedrich Weiss, the elderly man, adjusted his glasses with shaking fingers. "A dangerous time for recognition, my dear. We must be more careful than ever now." Helene nodded, knowing the truth of his words. The small group had survived this long by remaining invisible, both to the regime they had secretly opposed, and now to the occupying forces whose understanding of guilt and complicity was often painted in broad, indiscriminate strokes. "They will be patrolling this sector again tomorrow," Helene said, dividing the rations into 4 equal portions with methodical precision. "The same unit." "Then perhaps it is time we moved on," Margaret suggested, accepting her share with a small nod of thanks. Professor Weiss shook his head. "To where? The entire city is under occupation, and the roads out are monitored. Besides, our work is not finished." The work to which the professor referred was the preservation of documents. hundreds of pages of evidence meticulously collected over the years of conflict. Letters, photographs, official orders, and personal testimonies that, taken together, told a story that contradicted the simple narrative of collective guilt that threatened to engulf the German people in the aftermath of their defeat. "The Americans will never believe it came from us," the boy, Karl, said bitterly. "They have already decided what kind of people we are." "Not all of them, perhaps," Helene replied, her thoughts returning to the Marine with the kind eyes. "Not the one who gave me this food when he had no reason to do so." Professor Weiss studied her thoughtfully. "You are considering approaching him, aren't you?" Helene met his gaze steadily. "If he returns tomorrow, yes. We need someone who will listen, someone who might believe us. The documents must reach the right people, Friedrich. You know this better than anyone." The professor sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. "It is a terrible risk, Helene. If you are wrong about this man, then I alone will bear the consequences," she finished firmly. "The rest of you will have time to relocate the documents and yourselves." As the small group ate their unexpected meal in the dim light of the cellar, none could have predicted the extraordinary sequence of events that Helene's decision would set in motion. Events that would eventually reveal her true identity and connect her to one of the most significant intelligence operations of the conflict. The following day dawned cold and clear, the rain having passed during the night to reveal a sky of piercing blue, a cruel beauty that only emphasized the devastation below. Thomas Mitchell awoke early, his sleep having been disturbed by dreams he could not quite recall upon waking. A sense of anticipation followed him as he prepared for the day, though he could not have articulated its source. At morning assembly, Lieutenant Jackson announced that their patrol would indeed be returning to the sector they had covered the previous day, focusing specifically on checking the structural integrity of several buildings that intelligence believed might contain valuable documents or evidence of resistance activities. "Mitchell," the lieutenant added as the briefing concluded, "you will be responsible for documenting any findings. Your engineering background makes you the most qualified to assess whether these structures are stable enough for our intelligence teams to search thoroughly." Thomas accepted the assignment with a nod, ignoring the knowing looks from some of his fellow Marines. His encounter with the German woman had not gone unnoticed, and speculation had already begun about his motives for breaking formation to offer her food. Private Cooper fell into step beside him as they prepared to depart. "Hoping to see your friend again, Mitchell." Thomas adjusted his pack, which once again contained extra rations, this time officially assigned for potential distribution to cooperative civilians. "She is not my friend, Cooper, just someone who needed help." "Plenty of people need help," Cooper replied with a shrug. "Cannot save them all." "Not trying to save them all," Thomas said quietly. "Just doing what I can." The patrol set out under clear skies, retracing their route from the previous day. Thomas found himself scanning the streets with greater attention, noting details he had missed before. A child's doll lying abandoned in a puddle, curtains fluttering from a shattered window frame, a carefully tended pot of flowers placed incongruously amid the rubble, small assertions of humanity in a landscape defined by its absence. As they approached the street where Thomas had encountered Helene, he felt his heartbeat quicken slightly. He told himself it was merely the anticipation of completing his assignment, of finding something of value in the buildings they were tasked with examining. Yet when they turned the corner and he saw the empty doorway where she had stood, he could not deny the flicker of disappointment that passed through him. Lieutenant Jackson directed the patrol to split into pairs to examine the buildings more efficiently. "Mitchell, you and Donovan take the structure at the end of the street. Report back in 30 minutes." Thomas and Sergeant Donovan approached the designated building, the same one where Thomas had encountered the German woman. Up close, it appeared in better condition than many of its neighbors, though the windows on the upper floors had been blown out and part of the roof had collapsed. "Looks like someone might still be living here," Donovan observed as they entered the main hallway, noting the relative lack of debris on the floor. "Stay alert." They moved cautiously through the ground floor, Thomas making notes about the structural integrity, while Donovan checked each room for occupants or anything of intelligence value. The building had clearly been elegant once. High ceilings, ornate moldings, and the remnants of quality furnishings speaking to the status of its former inhabitants. As they completed their inspection of the ground floor, Thomas noticed a door that appeared to lead to a closet. Something about it caught his attention, perhaps the fact that the floor in front of it was cleaner than the surrounding area, suggesting recent use. "Sergeant, I want to check this," he said, moving toward the door. Donovan nodded, his rifle at the ready. "Careful, Mitchell. Could be booby-trapped." Thomas examined the door carefully before sliding it open, revealing not a closet, but a narrow staircase leading downward. The two Marines exchanged glances. "Cellar," Donovan said. "Better check it out." They descended the stairs slowly, alert for any signs of danger. At the bottom, they found a space that had been converted into a simple living area. 4 makeshift beds arranged against the walls, a small table with chairs, and shelves containing a few books and personal items. "Looks like we found where our survivors are hiding," Donovan said, lowering his rifle slightly. "But where are they now?" As if in answer to his question, a voice spoke from the shadows in the corner of the room. "We have been waiting for you." Thomas and Donovan both raised their rifles instinctively as Helene Weber stepped into the dim light, her hands raised to show she carried no weapon. Behind her appeared Professor Weiss, Margaret, and young Karl, all with their hands similarly displayed. "We mean no harm," Helene continued in careful, accented English. "We have something important to share with the American authorities." Donovan kept his rifle trained on the group. "Mitchell, go get the lieutenant." "Please," Professor Weiss said, his voice quavering slightly with age and tension. "What we have to show you cannot wait. Lives depend on it." Thomas hesitated, looking from the professor to Helene, whose eyes held the same intense determination he had noticed the day before. "Are you the woman from yesterday?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Helene nodded. "I am. And I took a risk accepting your kindness because I sensed you might be someone who would listen. We need someone who will listen now more than ever." "Listen to what?" Donovan demanded, his patience clearly wearing thin. "The truth about who I am," Helene replied, "and what we have been doing here while the world burned around us." It was at this moment that Lieutenant Jackson, alerted by their prolonged absence, appeared at the top of the stairs. "Mitchell, Donovan, report!" "4 civilians in the cellar, sir," Donovan called back. "They want to talk to us about something important." The lieutenant descended quickly, followed by Private Cooper and another Marine. With their arrival, the small cellar became crowded, the tension palpable as the armed Americans faced the 4 malnourished Germans. "What is this about?" Jackson demanded, his gaze sweeping over the group before settling on Helene, who appeared to be their spokesperson. "My name is Helene Weber," she began, her voice steady despite the 5 rifles pointed in her direction. "Though that is not my birth name. I was born Helene Hoffmann, daughter of General Wilhelm Hoffmann of the German General Staff." A ripple of surprise passed through the Marines. General Hoffmann was a name they recognized, a high-ranking officer who had been reported dead in 1943 after an internal purge of military leadership following the failed assassination attempt on the German leader. "My father was executed for his part in the resistance movement within the military," Helene continued. "Not the attempt on the leader's life, but for his work in documenting the atrocities being committed and attempting to establish contact with Allied forces regarding a potential surrender." "Convenient story," Lieutenant Jackson said skeptically. "Where is your proof?" Professor Weiss stepped forward cautiously. "If I may," he asked, gesturing toward a section of the floor near one of the beds. Jackson nodded, and the elderly professor knelt with difficulty, removing several loose bricks to reveal a hidden compartment. From this, he withdrew a leather document case. "Everything is here," he said, returning to stand beside Helene. "Names, dates, locations, photographs, official orders, all collected at enormous risk over 4 years. Thomas looked at Helene, understanding dawning. "You have been part of an intelligence operation." "Yes," she confirmed. "After my father's execution, I went into hiding with the help of Professor Weiss, who had been my father's colleague at the University of Dresden before the conflict. We continued his work, gathering evidence and establishing a network of informants within the military and government. Lieutenant Jackson's expression remained dubious. And why reveal yourselves to us now? Why not approach military intelligence directly? Because we tried. Margaret spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the harshness of someone who had seen too much. 3 weeks ago we sent Carl to the American headquarters with a letter explaining who we were and what we had. He was turned away, dismissed as just another German civilian looking for special treatment. We are running out of time, Professor Weiss added urgently. The documents must reach the right people before they are discovered and destroyed, either by those who would protect the guilty or by those who would punish indiscriminately. Lieutenant Jackson studied the group for a long moment before turning to Thomas. Mitchell, your assessment? Thomas was surprised to be asked his opinion, but responded honestly. Sir, I believe they are telling the truth. The structural integrity of this building is far better than its neighbors, making it an ideal location for a covert operation. And the woman, Miss Weber or Hoffman, I noticed something different about her yesterday. A purpose. Jackson considered this, then made a decision. Secure the documents. We will take all 4 into custody and let intelligence sort this out. Sir, Thomas ventured, these people are clearly malnourished and the elderly gentleman needs medical attention. Could we not provide some food and water before moving them? The lieutenant hesitated, then nodded. Distribute your rations, Mitchell. Cooper, go back to the checkpoint and radio for transport. Donovan, help me secure these documents. As the Marines carried out their orders, Thomas approached Helene with his pack of rations. Why did you decide to trust me? He asked quietly as he handed her the food. Her blue eyes met his directly. Because you saw me as a human being when you could have seen only an enemy. That kind of recognition goes both ways, Private Mitchell. For a brief moment, they stood in perfect understanding of one another. 2 people caught in the machinery of history who had somehow managed to maintain their humanity. Within the hour, transport arrived to take Helene and her companions, along with their precious documents, to the American intelligence headquarters. Thomas watched as they were loaded into the vehicle, uncertain whether he would ever see any of them again. The last image he had was of Helene turning to look back at him, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude, apprehension, and something that might have been hope. 3 days passed before Thomas heard anything further about the German civilians they had discovered. During that time, he continued his duties with the patrol unit, though his thoughts often returned to the cellar and its occupants. Had their information been valuable? Were they being treated well? These questions remained unanswered until Lieutenant Jackson called him to the command post. Mitchell, the lieutenant said without preamble, you have been temporarily reassigned. Report to Captain Reynolds at intelligence headquarters immediately. Thomas blinked in surprise. May I ask why, sir? Apparently the woman specifically requested your presence, Jackson replied with a slight frown. Said you were the only one she fully trusted. Captain Reynolds wants you to assist with the verification process for the documents they provided. 45 minutes later, Thomas found himself in a sparsely furnished room at intelligence headquarters, facing Captain Reynolds, a sharp-eyed officer with a reputation for thoroughness and skepticism. Private Mitchell, Reynolds began. I understand you were the first to make contact with Helene Hoffman. Yes, sir, Thomas confirmed, though I did not know her identity at the time. Reynolds nodded. What was your impression of her? Thomas considered his answer carefully. Dignified, sir, determined. Someone who had endured much but remained purposeful. An accurate assessment, Reynolds acknowledged, surprising Thomas with the approval in his tone. The documents she and her group provided are authentic and extraordinary. They contain evidence of an organized resistance movement within the German military dating back to 1941, including communications with Allied intelligence that were either ignored or never reached the appropriate channels. Thomas absorbed this information, thinking of Helene's father and the risks he must have taken. What happens to them now, sir? That is partially why you are here, Reynolds replied. Miss Hoffman has agreed to continue assisting us with identifying key individuals mentioned in the documents, but she has established certain conditions, one being that you serve as her liaison. Me, sir, Thomas asked, unable to hide his surprise. "I have no intelligence training." "No, but you have something perhaps more valuable in this situation, her trust." Reynolds studied him thoughtfully. "She believes you see things differently, Mitchell, that you understand what most cannot, the complexity of guilt and innocence in times like these." Before Thomas could respond, the door opened and Helene entered, accompanied by a female officer. The change in her appearance was striking. Clean, properly fed, and dressed in civilian clothes provided by the Americans, she bore little resemblance to the desperate woman Thomas had encountered in the doorway, yet her eyes remained the same, clear, direct, and fiercely intelligent. "Private Mitchell," she said with a small smile, "thank you for coming." Over the following weeks, Thomas worked closely with Helene and the intelligence team, helping to process the vast amount of information contained in the documents she and her group had preserved. He learned the full extent of her story, how after her father's execution, she had taken on a false identity and worked tirelessly to continue his mission. The documents revealed a network of resistance that had operated at great risk throughout the conflict, saving hundreds of lives and gathering critical intelligence. General Hoffman had established communication channels with certain Allied officials as early as 1942, attempting to negotiate terms for removing the German leader from power and ending the conflict before it consumed all of Europe. His efforts, like those of many others, had been tragically undermined by mistrust, miscommunication, and the relentless machinery of destruction that had been set in motion. For Thomas, the experience transformed his understanding of the conflict and its aftermath. The neat categories of us and them, of heroes and villains, gave way to a more nuanced comprehension of how ordinary people could find themselves caught in extraordinary circumstances, making impossible choices. Helene Hoffman's testimony and the documents she provided would eventually play a significant role in the ongoing trials of war criminals, helping to establish a clearer distinction between those who had actively participated in atrocities and those who had been coerced or deceived. Her father's legacy, a commitment to truth and justice, even at the cost of his life, would be recognized, though quietly and without fanfare, in the complex accounting that followed the conflict. As for Thomas and Helene, their story continued beyond those initial weeks of collaboration. The connection formed in that moment of simple human recognition, a Marine offering food to a hungry woman, deepened into something neither could have anticipated. After completing his military service, Thomas returned to his engineering studies, now with a focus on reconstruction. Helene, granted asylum in the United States in recognition of her service, pursued a career in international law, working to establish the frameworks that would help prevent future conflicts. They were married in Portland, Maine, in the spring of 1947, an unlikely union born from the ashes of global devastation. Their wedding was attended by Professor Weiss, Margaret, and Carl, all of whom had found new paths forward in the post-conflict world. In the decades that followed, Thomas and Helene Mitchell would speak occasionally at universities and historical societies about their experiences, emphasizing always the power of individual choices in the face of systemic inhumanity. They established a foundation dedicated to preserving the testimonies of resistance members from all nations involved in the conflict, ensuring that these complex narratives would not be lost to simplified historical accounts. Their story served as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments of human history, acts of compassion and courage continue to illuminate the path forward. That recognition of our shared humanity across all dividing lines remains our greatest hope for a more just and peaceful world. The Dresden Papers, as the documents collected by General Hoffman and preserved by his daughter came to be known, are now housed in the International Archives for Human Rights, accessible to scholars and researchers from around the world. They stand as testament to the truth that in every conflict, in every nation, there are those who refuse to surrender their conscience to the demands of power, those who risk everything to protect the values they believe transcend national identity and political allegiance. And it all began with a single K-ration, offered by a young Marine to a starving woman in a doorway, a small act of kindness that would ultimately reveal one of the most significant untold stories of the greatest conflict in modern history. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, Please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.